Hello, everybody, and welcome to the lecture for week 3. And in this week and in this lecture, we're going to talk about how do anthropologists conduct fieldwork. We're going to look at, more specifically, how is cultural anthropology fieldwork conducted. We'll look at various techniques as well as methods, as well as we'll look at a few of our anthropologists who contributed quite a bit to how we do fieldwork today. Before we get into the different techniques and methodologies that are used by cultural anthropologists during their fieldwork, it's important to kind of start out with a very basic understanding of kind of how anthropology is done, right? Cultural anthropologists make an emotional investment in their research subjects. So in essence, you know, they live with the people, they experience the same emotions as the people throughout their daily lives and things like that. So they really build a connection with the group and the culture that they are studying. And the presence of the anthropologist will ultimately alter the behavior of the research subjects. This is what we refer to as the ethnographic dilemma, right? Just by the anthropologist being there, it will invariably alter the behavior of the people in the culture they are observing, right? It's kind of the same concept as some people act a little differently when they are put on video camera as opposed to off of video camera, right? It's that knowledge that they are being watched and observed that causes them to behave slightly differently, right? So the same thing works and the same kind of phenomenon occurs when it's an anthropologist doing their field work amongst a group of people. So from an evolutionary perspective, we kind of look at cultural anthropology and how they conduct field work as really the goal of that field work is to really determine how varying cultures across the world respond to various environmental pressures, right? Things like how do they respond to temperature, how do they respond to coming into contact with other humans, right? It's really the interaction between the human group itself and the environment around it that really molds culture, right? So cultural anthropologists want to understand how different groups respond to different life events like death, birth, illness, natural disasters, things like that, right? So field work always begins with the people. There are many different facets to ethnographic study within cultural anthropology. During fieldwork, anthropologists may look at any or all of these subjects. They may look at religious practices and beliefs and ceremonies surrounding that. They may look at power relationships. How are the leaders of the group chosen, and how does power play a role within the culture? They'll look at social organization. How do people organize themselves in terms of their living patterns? They'll look at marriage and family relationships, something that we call kinship in anthropology, and they will look at contact between two cultures, right? How does that culture they're studying respond to, other cultures that they come into contact with? Many people kind of assume that cultural anthropologists only kind of study these isolated Amazonian tribes out there in the middle of nowhere, the kind of exotic tribes that we're not familiar with and the exotic cultures and people that we're not familiar with. While that is, there's some truth to that, in the classic sense that's what many anthropologists did for decades, really kind of more recently, there really are no long lost tribes out there or uncontacted cultures that we don't, that we aren't aware of. So what we do as anthropologists in cultural anthropology today is we look at different cultural elements within these large-scale cultures like United States, right? For example, we have Brackett William, who studied how homeless people in several states on the East Coast respond to the pressures of modern society, right? How do they respond to the need to have a cell phone? How do they respond to the need to be able to digitally communicate with other individuals? How do they respond to the ordinary pressures of homelessness, starvation, and things like that, right? So anthropologists today are really looking at essentially societal issues that occur within large-scale societies, as well as looking at smaller societies as well. So if we look at an example of kind of the case studies that we see in modern anthropology today, I'm going to use one of the originals that kind of started this whole notion of working within large societies. We have the ethnography that was done by Oscar Lewis called Five Families. This was done in the 1950s, but it's still very relevant and salient today in terms of its conclusions. And it really demonstrates how anthropology can be conducted in a larger scale society, in a larger culture. So what he did is he lived with 5 separate families who were in 5 distinct economic classes within Mexico City. He studied how each family responded to their economic class and how they compensated for economic inadequacies by developing cultural coping mechanisms such as machismo, which is this kind of notion of bravado and bravery, and how that kind of bravado and bravery makes you more of a whole person and more kind of macho. Lewis's ethnography kind of exemplifies how cultural anthropologists conduct fieldwork in larger societies, right? So what he did is he looked at 5 families that were living at 5 distinct economic levels within that society. So he got a good idea of kind of how culture within a culture will vary based on economic class. So it shows us how these kind of ethnographies can be created and how these different subject matters can be kind of pulled out of large-scale culture. So if we look at the development of ethnographic field work for cultural anthropology, we know that written descriptions of cultures have existed for many centuries, right? The practice of ethnographic research, or in other words, the scientific examination of cultural practices, didn't really develop until the mid-19th century with people like Bronislaw Malinowski and Franz Boas. So during kind of this period, cultural descriptions were really colored by Eurocentrism, right, which is promoting a worldview centered on and biased towards Western civilization. So in essence, what we're really looking at here is before Franz Boas and Bronislaw Malinowski, and before the kind of notion of historical particularism, which we talked about in prior lectures, in essence, they were essentially providing these cultural descriptions, but they were really just comparisons saying, hey, look at these weird people that we found, look at how weird they live, and we're going to compare it to our Western civilization, which we think is so much better, right? There wasn't really much scientific or objective viewing of this culture, really any actual academic interest in what these cultures and what their kind of mechanisms or internal workings were. So if we go to our very, very earliest anthropologist, or who's kind of coined as our earliest anthropologist, we have Herodotus from 484 to 425 BC. Some of you may be familiar with him if you've taken any Greek history classes, but he was a Greek historian that may have actually been our earliest anthropologist. He recorded observations of other cultures from his travels in Syria, Egypt, and Persia, right? Even making his own maps and providing complete cultural descriptions, right? So we kind of credit him as being our earliest anthropologist, even though this was before we even had a concept of anthropology. So to kind of start off with our kind of earliest scientific anthropologists, still during this time period, during the 19th century, you still have a lot of anthropologists that are kind of promoting this comparison between Western civilization versus other cultures, and kind of looking to prove that Western civilization is the pinnacle of cultural evolution. One of those individuals was Lewis Henry Morgan. He's one of our first anthropologists to conduct field work amongst Indigenous people. He worked amongst the Iroquois, and at the time he was trying to prove the notion that he came up with called unilineal cultural evolution, right? And that proposes that all cultures move on a predetermined developmental trajectory from savagery to barbarism to civilization, right? And there are certain technological elements that exist at each level. There are certain cultural elements that exist at each level, and Lewis Henry Morgan thought that he can create this concrete trajectory and apply it to every single human culture, which we know today is doesn't really work very well, because human cultures are very, very variable in how they determine things like how they view things like time, how they view appropriate behaviors between individuals, how they even view kinship and marriage practices. So you can't really apply one evolutionary schema to every single culture amongst our species. Our next prominent cultural scientist and anthropologist is Franz Boas. We've already talked about him briefly in our other lectures. Remember, he worked with both indigenous societies as well as with Western societies with his Ellis Island project. He developed the four-field approach, which is kind of that breakdown of the different subfields of anthropology. He developed the school of historical particularism. Remember, that's the notion that you should view each culture in light of its own unique history. He debunked biological determinism. That was the result of his Ellis Island study. And he promoted cultural relativism, right? That whole notion that we cannot judge other cultures based on their cultural practices. There's really no need to compare one culture to another. So then we have Bronislaw Malinowski. We've also talked about him in prior lectures as well. He developed that concept of participant observation when he lived and worked with the Trobriand Islanders in the South Pacific. He was the first to really urge anthropologists on a wide scale to stay for long periods of time among the cultures they are observing. And just remember, we define participant observation as participating in and observation of the daily life of the people or culture being studied. Another prominent figure that we have that we will talk about again during our week on the variety of religion within different cultures, we have E. Evans Pritchard. He was a British social anthropologist, and remember, we define social anthropology as a science, or anthropology as a science with the purpose of investigating the underlying patterns in culture, right? So our social anthropologists are really interested in determining what are the commonalities between all of the different cultures on Earth. He did his participant observation and field work amongst the Nuer and Sudan. He was particularly interested in the purpose of ritual and magic and tried to find patterns amongst Nuer beliefs in magic and other mainstream religions from larger cultures. He was trying to see, are there the same basic rationales for why people believe in religion? Then we have perhaps our most famous anthropologist, Margaret Mead. At least she's the most famous in the United States. She was actually a part of the first generation of students to come out of the school, the original school of kind of anthropology that was founded at the University of Chicago by Franz Boas. And she was really the first to bring things like gender identity and sexuality as a element of cultural study to the forefront. Before that, anthropologists were really focused on what men were doing within different tribes. They weren't really addressing sexuality or gender identity. And Margaret Mead kind of was the first to bring that out. She did her work amongst the teenage girls in Hawaii or the American Samoa, and her goal was to prove that gender roles were culturally specific, right? Thus debunking the notion that gender roles are biologically determined. What Margaret Mead's real point was is that she wanted to say that gender itself was a culturally constructed element, much like race, right? And that gender is not specifically biologically, or the behaviors around gender are not exclusively biologically driven. So Mead became one of our best-selling authors in the subject of anthropology. You can still find her ethnography, The Coming of Age in Samoa, in most bookstores today. And Mead found that almost most Samoan people were very religious and pious on the surface. The adolescent girls were wildly promiscuous, which defied their religious dogma on behavior, right? So what she wanted to say is that, even within a culture, what you would be considered the appropriate behaviors are not necessarily the actual behaviors which are going on, right? And part of anthropology is really getting at the heart of why people behave the way they do within specific cultures. But Margaret Mead was not without her detractors or people that disagree with her opinions. Derek Friedman, who was a Australian anthropologist, later claimed after interviewing some of the same informants that Mead interviewed in Hawaii that Mead lied and presented false data with her ethnography. The controversy was really around how Mead coded her field notes so that no one could match a particular name to an actual person. So in other words, she really did not use the real names and tried to maintain anonymity amongst the people that she interviewed, which is actually today a very, very common practice within anthropology. That's kind of important to note that most anthropologists today try to maintain a certain degree of anonymity amongst the people they interview, right? So long story short, the controversy was as to whether or not Mead fudged her data. Today it's still unresolved. You can actually follow the link here and read about the whole controversy. And many anthropologists over the past 60 years have actually weighed in on this controversy, and it really kind of died out when Freeman died in 2001. So kind of off of the breakthrough that Margaret Mead did in introducing gender identity studies and studies on sexuality to anthropology, by the 1980s, feminist anthropology started to really become part of its own discipline and began to change cultural theory. We have Annette Weiner and Kathleen Goff, who re-examined E. Evans Pritchard's work and found some androcentric themes in his interpretation of newer religious practices. Another major contribution of feminist anthropology was to bring women to the forefront in ethnographic writing, right? Feminist anthropologists were the first to treat child rearing as an integral part of culture. And really what Weiner and Goff were looking at with Pritchard's work was, why did Pritchard focus so much on what the men were doing with their religious practices? And because Pritchard focused so much on the religious practices of the men, he missed all of the reproductive religious practices and other rituals that the women were doing. So in essence, Pritchard really wasn't getting a full picture of the culture. And that's what Weiner and Goff were really bringing to the forefront, was the notion that anthropology really needed to consider exactly what the men were doing as well as what the women were doing in order to get a complete picture of any given culture. Feminist anthropologists also introduced the notion of reflexivity in the field work of cultural anthropology. And reflexivity is a recognition that one's own self and identity affects their field work and theoretical interpretations of data. And this is very important, right? This is the kind of recognition that all people are biased in one way or another. So we kind of have to recognize that bias when we are conducting our field work. So moving on to kind of the steps that we use to conduct fieldwork, just real briefly, we start with a research design, then we move to a literature review. Then, of course, you obtain funding for your project, as well as traveling to the location and living amongst the group you are intending to study and gathering data. So our research design is essentially posing a series of questions about the culture you want to study. The research questions are malleable, right? They can change during the course of your observation, but your research questions must be testable, right? Remember, this is anthropology is a science, so you have to be able to kind of gather data off of your research question. The literature review is absolutely essential, right? Cultural anthropologists will generally review all academic work, traveler's notes, and historical documents relating to the geographic region as well as the culture that they are looking to study, right? Part of a literature review also involves learning the language or the lingo of the culture you are intending to study, right? So a thorough literature review is essential, right? Especially learning the language, right? Or at least learning it enough to be able to communicate with the culture you're intending on living amongst. Then, of course, you have the probably the most frustrating phase of any research design or research project. You have the funding, right? And funding can either come from private or public sources, right? There's a lot of companies that will donate money to various research foundations, as well as, of course, you have the National Science Foundation or the Council for the Arts and Humanities. These are all national organizations that provide funding. So you basically apply for grants and fellowships, which will provide you with money you can use to conduct your research. The next step to conducting your field work is, of course, traveling to the location, right? In many cases, anthropologists will usually make first contact. If you're going out into a kind of remote region, you will make first contact with the nearest government entity, kind of just to make sure, more of a kind of a safety measure, right? In case something happens, they need to be aware that you're out there. In some instances, anthropologists will travel for days on foot to reach their research subjects. And pre-fieldwork health screenings, of course, are absolutely necessary. In some places, you will need to get vaccinations for various diseases that you don't deal with in your society or in your geographic region, but you will have to deal with if you go and live in another region. So it's very important to kind of be aware of what the different government policies are and entities near the group of people you are looking to study, as well as being able to know what type of potential health hazards and dangers there are out in that area. So you have various types of data in terms of gathering. You have qualitative data and quantitative data. Your qualitative data is descriptions. It involves characteristics that cannot be counted. And your quantitative data are the numbers and are obtained by counting or measuring. And in a lot of instances in cultural anthropology, you will have to convert qualitative data over to quantitative data. I will give you an example from my own research. I looked into reconstructing the prehistoric diet of a group of people that lived 1,000 years ago in northwestern Ohio. I took the dental calculus and put it under a microscope and counted the different starch grains and things like that I found in the teeth. And the problem was when you start to run the statistics on, thousands of starch grains, there's a high degree of variation between individuals. So I wanted to know whether or not I was able to run statistics on the population as a whole and able to simplify the numbers. So I used simple presence versus absence on the teeth, right? Did I find cornstarch in the teeth? If I did, then I used the number 1 to indicate presence, and if I did not, it was the number 0 to indicate absence, right? So then it is able to simplify the population statistics for that project, right? So you can actually take qualitative data like presence versus absence and turn it into quantitative data. So your data is collected in several different ways. Of course, you always want to do during your literature review, you have prior academic work, so you want to look at prior data that has been collected on the culture you are studying. You also have media elements like visual ethnographies. You can go in there and make a documentary or use audio recording equipment or visual recording equipment to document. You can also keep a fieldwork journal where you write down all the data that you are collecting. Just to give you some examples of our different types of data, right? We talked about quantitative versus qualitative. So your quantitative data would be things like the average height of the people that you are studying, whether or not, how many people have blue eyes versus brown eyes, things like that, things that you can count. The qualitative data would be things like the meaning behind a certain dance or the meaning behind a certain ritual, things that you can't necessarily count. When conducting your analysis of the cultural data that you've gathered, you can take two different perspectives, either emic or etic, right? The emic perspective approaches cultural data from the viewpoint of the person within the culture being examined, right? The viewpoint of the local people and how they understand the world. And really that's kind of the goal of what most cultural anthropologists are getting at. If you are looking to answer a broader question, maybe more along the lines of using your data for ethnological research rather than producing an ethnography, you would take the etic perspective, which approaches cultural data from the viewpoint of the anthropologist and how that cultural data can be compared across different cultures. So remember, we have two kind of end products of cultural research via anthropology. We have the production of an ethnography or a cultural description, or we have the production of an ethnology, which is comparing different cultural elements cross-culturally. So let's look at writing and ethnography, right? Anthropological data should not be interpreted in the field, right? That's kind of important. The purpose of fieldwork or your fieldwork notebook is to record observations, feelings, notions, thoughts, etc., right, so that the data can be interpreted later. And there's several considerations that need to be taken before writing an ethnography. You have to take into consideration the voice you want to use, the tone that your writing is going to take, the style of the writing, as well as your sense of authority that you portray in your writing. So in terms of ethnographic writing, in terms of voice, polyvocality is important in anthropological writing. And polyvocality refers to using multiple voices in research question formulation and data interpretation, right? This ensures that many perspectives within a given culture are being heard, right? And this is really just the notion that when you're interviewing various members of the culture, you want to get as many different perspectives as possible, right? And you want to translate those perspectives into your ethnographic writing by using polyvocality. You also have tone/authority. Anthropologists must assume a tone of authority, yet do so without placing the culture of study within a conceptual box, right? The anthropologist must choose what claims, assertions, or material to be included in the cultural description. The anthropologists also act as an authoritarian figure, but also as an advocate for that culture, right? So what you're doing is you're presenting that culture to the rest of the world. You're presenting it to people who will probably never meet that culture. You're presenting it to people who will never have contact with that culture, right? So you want to be able to not only be an authoritative figure in terms of knowing and having the knowledge about the culture, you also want to act as an advocate for that culture as well. You also want to take into consideration style, right? In modern ethnographic writing, the author tries to write in a style that will appeal to the broadest audience of readers, because let's face it, right? Without reaching people and creating demand, no one would really fund anthropological research, right? It's really that kind of connection of bringing these various cultures to different people that really kind of drives that demand for anthropological research. So to use an example of a research design, we'll look at Boas, Franz Boas's original research design for one of his earliest projects. Remember that Boas used historical particularism as a framework for his research design, meaning that he always kept in mind that that culture he was looking at and the data he was collecting is going to be specifically unique to that culture and shouldn't really be used to be compared with other cultures. He also believed in the notion of empiricism, which is study through direct observation and data gathering. And he was more interested in gathering data rather than composing overall anthropological theories that apply to many cultures. He was mostly very invested in historical particularism and viewing each culture in its own unique light. So Boas originally went to a place called the Baffin Islands and looked at the indigenous people that were living there. This was an expedition that he started in 1883, shortly after he ended his kind of early education. And he lived with the native people for around 6 months, right? He recorded the social organization as well as the subsistence practices, in other words, how they gathered food and resources, as well as the religious rituals of the people. He was interested in how people survived in such an inhospitable environment, living well above the Arctic Circle. This is showing you one of the original images that Boas took of our Baffin Islanders back in 1883. So based off of his research in the Baffin Islands, as well as a few other Native American tribes in Canada, Boas really came up with what he considered was the central question within anthropology that he published in an academic journal called Anthropology in 1907. And that question is, why are the tribes and nations of the world different? And how have those present differences developed? So remember the quandaries that we talked about in terms of field work, right? We talked about the ethnographic dilemma, right? The very presence of an anthropologist will alter the behavior of the people. Anthropologists can be very susceptible to bias, right? In many cases, anthropologists, because they become so emotionally invested while they're doing their field work, will kind of come back from field work and not write their ethnography or their cultural description for some time to kind of allow their mind an opportunity to clear some of that bias out before they begin to write. So there's a recognition of the influence that bias has on interpretations, and remember, this is known as reflexivity. One of our famous anthropologists, Clifford Geertz, pointed out that although an anthropologist may spend extended periods of time with a culture, they are really only obtaining a snapshot of cultural information, right? Clifford asserts that all anthropologists must recognize and acknowledge this limitation in their writing, that there may be things within their cultural description that they are missing, right? Because they are not members of that culture, and they are not, they didn't grow up in that culture, and they don't live with that culture full time, so there could be things that they are missing. So if we look at a case study in ethnographic writing, and if you get an opportunity, this is one of the ethnographies you can choose to do an academic review on. It is actually a very, very good ethnography, very well written. It is written by Margery Wolf in 1992, and what it does, it presents three separate perspectives surrounding a series of events involving a young mother in a Taiwanese village. It's an excellent read, and it's required reading in most anthropology graduate programs in the United States. So in essence, there was a young mother, her name was Mrs. Tan, and started displaying bizarre behavior one day, such as uncontrolled crying, speaking in languages that were unidentified, as well as crawling around in the muddy rice paddy fields across the street from her house and eating snails and slugs live. The villagers that she lived with speculated on what her condition or what had caused her condition. Some said illness, others said possession by a god, or being a hoax by the husband or orchestrated by the husband to get sympathy and money. So what this really, ethnography really addressed was, how do we have these differences in opinion among this kind of interesting series of events? And what Wolf kind of figured out was, well, depending on gender and depending on ideas of age, really kind of determined what your opinions are on the events that were occurring. So Wolf presented her work in three separate versions. The first version is presented as a fictional account telling of the villagers' reaction shortly after seeing the incidents with Mrs. Tan. Another version included Wolf's raw field notes for the reader to interpret. And then the last version in the ethnography contained a perspective of the anthropologist presenting the work through a theoretical lens. So what Wolf really did was she looked at three different aspects of anthropological fieldwork in and of itself, right? She presented the raw fieldwork or the raw field notes, which allows the anthropologist or kind of the anthropology student to really kind of form their own interpretation of the data. She also presented kind of a fictional account or kind of a more storytelling version of it that really appealed to kind of more of the broader read, of the more broader reader. She also kind of presented a theoretical version which really kind of appealed to the professional anthropologist. All at the, in each of these perspectives recognizes the bias in which she could possibly present in writing this ethnography. Getting back to the elements of fieldwork here, we have informants versus key informants in our cultural studies. An informant is any person within the culture who gives the anthropologist cultural data. The key informant, on the other hand, is the main person which the anthropologist communicates with. The key informant acts as a bridge between the anthropologist and the culture being studied. In many cases, the anthropologist will actually live with and kind of observe with their key informant. Their key informant acts as kind of the interpreter between the anthropologist and the culture. So when you are looking at cultural data, right, remember that anthropologists will always sit on their data for a little bit of time to kind of clear out that notion of bias. Recording data involves taking notes of emotional reactions, ritual steps, and other cultural details. Interpretation, on the other hand, involves taking that recorded data and translating it into cross-cultural meaning so that members of other cultures can understand and really get a good idea on how these other people live. So what do we do when we come across a complex society that has, millions and millions of cultural members, right? Places like China, the United States, Western Europe. What we do are multi-sited ethnographies, right? You may take the approach of having multiple researchers collecting data, and then you pull that data together. And usually during these kind of more complex cultural studies, we look at solving a specific cultural element or solving a specific cultural problem. So far in the lecture, most of what we've talked about is what we see in terms of ethnographic writing or writing in ethnography. So let's take a look at ethnologies, which utilize something called the comparative method, right? Which compares practices from multiple different cultures looking for common themes, such as rite of passages, elements within conflict, or elements of economy or kinship that might be common between various cultures. If we look at one example of a kind of ethnological study that Franz Boas contributed to, we have the Kwakiutl, or the kind of ethnographic research on the Kwakiutl. And one element that I'll look at, that's common amongst many, many cultures, many different cultures throughout the world, is the wedding, right? The Kwakiutl wedding is different in kind of our notion of a wedding in that it spans several months. It begins with economic negotiations, and you have to kind of ask yourself why. In this kind of situation, and in a lot of situations across the world, and we'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about kinship, marriage is not just the act of two people in love joining together to form a new household, right? In many instances, marriages are actually there's a certain economic element, because in a lot of smaller cultures and a lot of smaller societies, when someone is marrying, one of those individuals, whether it's the groom or the bride, ends up moving out of their family unit and starting their own, which means that that family unit is losing a worker who can contribute towards gathering resources for the family as a whole. So there needs to be a little bit of compensation for that. In Kwakiutl groups, men dress as warriors and sing war songs prior to ceremonies, because in the Kwakiutl, weddings are actually a metaphor for warfare, and warfare is a metaphor for weddings. And that actually goes back to deep in their history, when different tribal groups would compete with one another for access to marriageable partners between clans. You also have the notion of bride wealth versus dowry. We'll get into this in much more detail when we talk about kinship. In essence, a bride wealth is an amount of money that the groom's family will pay the bride's family in exchange for the marriage partner. A dowry, on the other hand, is resources or money that the bride's family pays to the groom's family in exchange for the bridal partner. In the Kwakiutl, they view wedding as warfare, primarily because the metaphor is that it's similar in that two sets of affine or kin groups are fighting for a prize, and that prize is over the hereditary cultural identity of the children of the newly married couple, right? And this relates back to the kind of antagonism and competition between the Kwakiutl clan groups and the moieties. The husband, in essence, captures the wife from her moiety, and it's the wife's moiety's responsibility to come back and capture the cultural identity of the newly born children that will occur after the marriage. This is showing you the husband coming in on his war canoe to kind of start the marriage ceremonies. And I don't want you to kind of get the idea that this is violent in any way, or that this is all strictly ceremonial, what they mean by capturing the wife. And really what this all relates back to is economy, right? When they're living in a small group like this, what this is doing, and what this kind of ritual warfare surrounding marriage practices is doing, is it's promoting group solidarity between various clans of the Kwakiutl tribe. This is an image taken from a modern Kwakiutl ceremony. So after you kind of have the capturing ceremony, or the kind of capturing rite, you then go into the actual wedding proper, which involves a lot of dancing, and all members of the various clans of the marrying members are present at the time of the ceremonies and the dances. So as part of the marriage ceremonies, you have what's called a potlatch. And a potlatch is kind of a ceremony where whoever is sponsoring the wedding will gather, everyone who's attending will bring an item or a piece of wealth to share with the group as a whole, and whoever's sponsoring the wedding gathers all of those materials, all those resources that are donated from everybody, and then redistributes them to various members of the tribe, right? What we refer to this as is wealth redistribution, and what it does is it plays into notions of reciprocity within the culture, right? And this plays an important role in Kwakiutl marriage ceremonies. You also have a bride wealth that is paid by the husband's numinid, in, this is just a Kwakiutl word for family, to quote-unquote purchase the bride. After the first child is born, the wife's family group pays the husband's family to, quote, repurchase the wife. Now, there's no actual purchasing going on here. What they're really doing is kind of creating this reciprocal system in order to redistribute wealth amongst these two clans, which really ensures that the culture and the group as a whole is going to be more sustainable and there's going to be more solidarity. So if we look at kind of using the comparative method, if we were doing an ethnological study, we would look at this notion of marriage or this wedding ceremony or marriage practices within the Kwakiutl, and we would compare them to another culture. For the sake of ease here, just as an example, we will compare it to kind of the typical quote-unquote American wedding. So in the Kwakiutl wedding, of course, you have the pre-wedding negotiations, you have the male war party arrival, the act of capturing the wife. During the marriage ceremony, you have a potlatch ceremony, which is the redistribution of wealth. You have the kinship joining ceremony, which is the actual wedding ceremony. And then, of course, in each culture, they are conducted by a ritual specialist, right? So you can kind of see how there's actual similarities between the American way of weddings and the Kwakiutl, right? Dating / proposals and that kind of whole courtship period in American relationships is kind of like the pre-wedding negotiations between families in the Kwakiutl. Then, of course, you have the bachelor versus bachelorette parties as kind of ceremonial act that occurs right before the wedding proper. And that's kind of like the arrival of the male war party and the act of capturing the wife from the opposing clan group, right? So there are elements between these two cultures that are common in this specific cultural element, like marriage and kinship. So let's look at another common cultural element that's compared a lot in anthropological writing, the notion of economy or exchange or money systems, right? And they're kind of based off of these kind of basic rationale that you have an item that I want and I have an item that you want, and we both want to maximize our benefit. So we kind of look at things like bartering versus market economies. We look at money and its significance will actually vary cross-culturally quite a bit, right? And it's important to know that in most cultures, money is connected to belief, not an actual physical commodity, right? Our American dollar is not actually attached to a physical commodity. Our American dollar is worth the amount that it's worth because we have that faith and belief that it is worth that amount, right? We are no longer on a gold or a silver standard with our money system. So in today's societies or kind of global economic systems, we kind of have these two fairy tales that pop up that are kind of supported by neoliberalist economic policy, that all human money originates from precious metals, which it actually does not. There are many cultures that use other items that act as valuable as precious metals. And that money and market economies replaced and evolved out of barter systems. They actually did not. There are still many, many barter systems that still exist in many cultures throughout the world today. So just to give you a few examples of different items that have been used to kind of represent money in various cultures, amongst the Yap, in Southeast Asia, you have the rye stones, which you can see one featured here. And the more rye stones you had that you were able to acquire from your neighbors, the more wealth you were considered, and the more wealthier you were considered to be within that culture, right? So this is just showing you that money doesn't necessarily, and concepts of wealth don't necessarily have to go strictly back to ideas about paper money. In ancient China, as well as in still some of the kind of more rural parts of China today, you had these knives that acted as both currency as well as utilitarian items as well. In the Solomon Islands, they used dolphin teeth as a form of currency, right? So it's just going to show you that not all currencies relate back to some sort of gem or some sort of precious metal, that different items that we find in the globe, whether it be animal teeth or it be large stones or it be precious jewels and gems, everything has varying value depending on the culture that you're living in. To kind of pull an example that we may be more familiar with is the Islamic banking systems that exist in the Middle East. One of the other notions that we kind of have in Western banking is that you always have to kind of benefit from a loan that you're giving. You have to charge interest, but for many, many years in history, as well as in modern Islamic banking, there is no interest as charged. It's called usury, and in a lot of major religions across the world, it's considered a sin to commit usury. So let's take a look at a few other case studies that really changed kind of how anthropological fieldwork and theoretical interpretations are. In May 2019, there was work amongst the Agta hunter-gatherers in the Philippines. And really what the changed, or really how this affected anthropology was it changed how we thought about hunting-gathering groups in general. We always kind of classically thought that hunter-gatherers were in this constant struggle for survival because they did not grow any of their own crops to eat. So they essentially had no free time in order to kind of do other activities. They were constantly in the search for food. Well, the study actually showed that leisure time reduces amongst cultures within the introduction of agriculture. So as soon as a culture adopts agriculture, the members of that culture on average have less free time and are actually spending more time in food acquisition than you would as a hunter-gatherer. And this is a map that shows you, as of 2018, the amount of hunter-gatherer groups that are still present throughout the globe. So you can see there's actually quite a bit of human groups that are still living exclusively off of hunting and gathering from wild resources. If we look at another case study in anthropology, we have the introduction of a new form of tuberculosis that's been found in refugee camps in Thailand, which is really interesting. It shows how kind of cultural exclusion can have serious health effects. In essence, these people, these refugees, are kind of stuck living in this refugee camp, and this kind of mass migration and this mass collection of humans and living in less than sanitary conditions is actually causing the development of new diseases that could be spread to different parts of the world. If we look at another case study in anthropology that is still kind of playing out today, we have the Ebola epidemic and the results of kind of cultural interactions with colonialism. This occurs in the Democratic Republic of Congo as well as Sierra Leone, which are epicenters for the Ebola virus outbreak. Health workers there that come from outside of the country are generally met with violent resistance in some areas. And this is really due to two factors. It's a lack of understanding on the burial practices practiced amongst these various cultures, as well as the history of colonialism and exploitation that occurred in these two countries. In essence, what's occurring here is because of colonialism in the Republic of Congo and Sierra Leone, the people have kind of developed this kind of distrust of outsiders. So when you have these health workers coming in that are trying to enforce new hygiene standards, new kind of burial practices and things like that, they're automatically met with distrust based on the kind of colonial history of the country itself. So really there has to be kind of work within understanding the burial practices of the culture as well as the history of the culture in order to resolve this conflict to kind of really get to the heart at why this virus continues to kind of outbreak in these particular areas. So what the importance of kind of studies like this is really because it's looking at how cultural interaction occurs over time, and it highlights the importance of taking cultural practices like burial rites into consideration. In the instance of the Congo and Sierra Leone, really the conflict evolved out of this notion that when they go to conduct their burial rites, there is each of the family members for the family of the deceased go and touch the individual who is deceased. Now, the international health workers came in and started restricting those families from being able to touch the individuals, which, done out of good intentions to prevent the spread of the virus. They did it without adequately really explaining to those people why that practice was going to cause the virus to spread. So you got this kind of cultural conflict that occurred, which really led to a lot of violent resistance. So to begin our wrap up here, remember that anthropologists have several techniques. We covered two of the very large ones, which is the process of writing ethnographies versus ethnologies. Remember that the comparative method is key in understanding the interactions that we find in human cultures, particularly since we are living in a more globalized world today. Anthropologists also must focus on the reflexivity, or their own bias and their own voice within their research. So always keep in mind that anthropologists can fall victim to ethical concerns as well during research and bias. Always remember that cultures may appear different from your own, but may have more universal rationales for why they do things, right? Money systems may vary greatly in terms of how they're used in different parts of the world and in different cultures, but there is that same basic rationale of you have an object that I want, and I will give you something for that object, right? It's the same thing with marriage, right? There may be various expressions of marriage practices in different cultures, but it's the same fundamental or universal rationale. It is the joining of two families so that those families can have better solidarity, as well as being able to garner more resources within your culture.